I'm joined in our Sydney studio now by the Immigration Minister, Scott Morrison. Mr Morrison, welcome to Capitol Hill.
Good to be with you, Lyndall.
We'll come to the Ebola virus in a moment, but first I wanted to ask you about the collection of biometric data as proposed in what's called the foreign fighters tranche of anti-terrorism laws. Under the laws, what material could be collected and who would do the collecting?
Well, currently what it relates to is the facial recognition imagery that we would be collecting as part of the eGate program that we have in place, and that's what is currently available to us and would be assisted by the legislation which is currently before the Parliament. Issues relating to fingerprints or other forms of biometric information would be the subject of additional regulatory requirements, which would obviously be subject to the normal parliamentary process that apply to such regulations.
But there is the potential in legislation for those regulations to be introduced and that material to be collected if the technology improves?
Well, and not just that, but the putting that technology in place, and that would require further regulation, which would also be subject to the normal privacy arrangements under the various acts. And I think it's important that I think people take a bit of a breath here. What we're talking about here is biometric information, which is becoming a common standard in what governments do to protect their citizens and to work together to protect more broadly against counter-terrorism and transnational crime. And these tools are becoming the basic tools that are really necessary in a modern age to combat the real threats in a proportionate way.
Although it does raise questions about the security of that information, because if your credit card details are hacked or leaked, you can replace your credit card. If your biometric details are hacked or leaked, you cannot replace your eyes or fingerprints or even the photographs of what your face looks like.
Well, first of all, we're only talking about facial recognition imagery at the present time, and as I said, these other things would be subject to other processes. And of course, there needs to be those secure systems, and those secure systems do exist, particularly for this type of information. And it's important that those processes and systems be in place, and that's what the government does.
So what are the secure systems that exist in place now?
Well, these are the internal systems that sit behind the various walls that are necessary to contain the security of this type of information. And that relates to a vast array of information that is already captured and collected and protected. And it's important that we have access to these tools, Lyndall. And so the government makes no apology for wanting to ensure that we are giving our law enforcement and counter-terrorism agencies access to the tools and the data and the information they need to protect Australians. That's why we're doing this.
We've already seen the Immigration Department, your department, accidentally released details of asylum seekers on its website. We've seen the Snowden leaks, which included some material from Australian intelligence agencies. In this day and age, is it possible to absolutely guarantee the security of this material?
Well, this information and the decisions you take has to be based on a risk assessment, and our systems are very good. The one you referred to in terms of immigration was in a completely different context and a different type of information, and how that is stored to the one that we're referring to in this conversation. And on that case, the weaknesses that were identified have been rectified. But if it's being put forward that we should be denying Australian law enforcement and counter-terrorism agencies the basic tools you need to do the job in this modern age to protect Australians from terrorists and to protect Australians from the impacts of transnational crime and other forms of activity that are nefarious to the Australian population. Well, the Australian government is going to take the steps that are necessary, and that's exactly what we're doing. And I think we've got good support for getting that done. One
final question on this issue. Will people know when their information is being collected?
Well, they're walking through those e-gates when they're doing that, and there's the normal signage and various other information that's provided at border checkpoints that will make these things clear, as is the case now in relation to how information is collected from people at airports or at other ports. And that's an important part of the process. But I think increasingly also, Lyndall, that travellers these days are becoming more used to the fact that these are just standard things that are necessary in this this modern age to deal with the global movement of people and the various risks that present. And it's important to say that the legislation requires this to be a proportionate response, and we believe it is a proportionate response and therefore an entirely lawful one and appropriate one. On
the question of Australia's response to the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, could Australia do more?
Well, $18 million is the contribution we've made, and as the Prime Minister said, that was described as a quick and effective response by the United Nations. And if you cannot put Australians in harm's way without a credible evacuation plan. And that is the clear advice that we have received as a government, that such a credible evacuation plan for people who would be put in this situation cannot be put in place, certainly at this current time. And look, I understand the sentiment that Ms Plibersek is acting on, but you can't govern on sentiment. You need to make decisions based on sensible judgment, based on the reality and the facts. And the government is focusing on what we are doing to protect the Australian community, and also acting in concert with regional partners to ensure that we can respond to any regional escalation of this threat. That's where our focus is. It's here in Australia and within our region to ensure that Australians are protected from this situation.
Is it potentially just fear, though, that might stop countries we would approach to help our citizens, countries like the UK, when Australia has spent time and money and put Australians in some danger to, say, pluck their citizens out of the Southern Ocean? Why wouldn't they help us in this instance?
Well, you just don't gamble on these things. You need to have an assurance, and these things are credibly put in place, that can guarantee our citizens the sort of extraction capability that you would have to have as a prerequisite before making any such decision. And I'm frankly puzzled at the naivety of the position being put forward by Ms Plibersek on this. You just heard it in her own interview then, that she could not say where she has been advised by anyone credibly that an evacuation program could be put in place for Australians who are being directed in this situation. I understand that there are people who want to participate with various NGOs and others who are engaged in that environment at present, and the Australian government is not preventing them from doing that. But there's a big difference between that and the government taking the decision to direct Australians into that very dangerous environment without having a credible extraction plan, should one be necessary. And the opposition has no information on that. They're acting out of sentiment, and I fear, and it's disappointing, that there seems to be a bit of politics being played with this.
One final question. Is Australia prepared for any potential outbreak here, and is there consideration being given to enhance the screening at airports?
Well, the screening presently, as you might have noted from an earlier press conference today by Minister Dutton, over 700 people so far have been identified, and we have sophisticated targeting mechanisms and for knowing where people are coming from and profiling, which enables us to address that situation at present. Now, if the Chief Medical Officer has a view that these things need to be elevated, then that can be done, and it would be done swiftly. Presently, our systems and processes are working extremely well in relation to this issue, and there are contingencies and further levels of escalation that are available to us, whether it's at the borders, where I have responsibility, or otherwise, that under the CMOs, as well as with the Minister for Health, we would be able to enact that. So at presently, I can say that the government has got its eyes firmly focused on this issue, and firmly focused at home here in Australia to make sure our systems and response capacity is in place, but also importantly in the region where we would be called on, specifically if there were issues that presented in nearby countries that might not have the capacity to respond, then we're ensuring that we're in a position to provide that assistance, because that would be our regional leadership responsibility.
Scott Morrison, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks very much, Lyndall.